Go back to your fantasy football games, boy. Leave the real strategic work to people who understand business. My name is Alex Rivera. I'm 28 years old, and I've been working at TechFlow Systems in Seattle for 3 years. I hold 4 pending patents for the core security framework that runs their entire platform. The woman who just dismissed me like some junior developer is Chloe Sterling, 25, fresh out of Harvard with her MBA and 0 real technical experience. She's also the new CTO's daughter. I was sitting at my workstation at 9:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, debugging the authentication module for tomorrow's client demo. The office was mostly empty except for the cleaning crew and a few other developers. I preferred it that way. No interruptions, no meetings about meetings, just code and coffee. Chloe walked by in her designer heels, carrying an iPad that probably contained acquisition analysis documents. I could see my technical specifications reflected on her screen. "Still here, Alex?" she said, stopping at my desk. "Don't you have a life outside coding?" I looked up from my screen, just finishing the security patch that would ensure tomorrow's demo ran smoothly. "Just making sure everything works perfectly for the client presentation," I said. She glanced at my monitor like she was trying to read a foreign language, which for her, it probably was. "Right, well, maybe you should take a break. Go back to your fantasy football games, boy. Leave the real strategic work to people who understand business." I didn't respond. I never played fantasy football. I spent my evenings writing code that kept their platform secure and competitive. But explaining that to someone who thought business strategy trumped technical expertise seemed pointless. After she walked away, I sat there for a moment staring at the authentication framework I'd built. Every algorithm, every security protocol, every performance optimization that made TechFlow competitive had come from my mind and my hands. The patents I'd filed were still my property. I'd developed them 18 months before Victoria Sterling joined as CTO. The legal documentation was clear. I owned the intellectual property until a formal licensing agreement transferred it to the company. That transfer hadn't happened yet. I saved my work and packed up my laptop. As I walked toward the elevator, I noticed the conference room lights were still on. Through the glass, I could see Chloe presenting something to her mother, Victoria. They were reviewing documents that looked suspiciously like my patent filings. The elevator doors closed, and I realized something had shifted in my mind. Not anger exactly, but clarity. I'd been carrying this company's technical foundation for years while watching less qualified people make strategic decisions about my work. Now I was being dismissed by someone who couldn't debug a simple loop. I drove home through the Seattle rain, thinking about what I'd seen on Chloe's screen. I joined TechFlow right out of college when it was still a 40-person startup, working out of a converted warehouse. Back then, the founder, David Chen, would sit with us during late-night coding sessions, ordering pizza and talking through complex security challenges. David understood the technology because he'd written the first version himself. David stepped down 4 months ago to focus on his health, prostate cancer, stage 2. The board brought in Victoria Sterling from a big consulting firm to professionalize operations and prepare for scale. Victoria had an impressive resume managing large teams, but her technical background was limited to whatever she'd learned in business school 15 years ago. My patents covered the core authentication system, the encryption algorithms, and the real-time threat detection that made TechFlow's platform unique. Without those components, we were just another cloud security company with a decent interface. I developed them during my own time using my personal equipment, because I wanted to solve problems that the industry hadn't properly addressed yet. The patents were filed under my name because I'd paid for the legal work myself. Standard practice was to transfer them to the company through a licensing agreement. But that negotiation had been delayed by David's illness and Victoria's arrival. My lawyer had advised me to wait until the management transition was complete to ensure I got proper recognition and compensation for the intellectual property. Chloe had joined the company 1 month ago as a strategy analyst, reporting directly to her mother. She had no official technical role, but she'd been sitting in on engineering meetings and offering suggestions about resource optimization and development priorities. Last week, she'd suggested that the engineering team was overstaffed and that we could probably deliver the same results with fewer senior developers. I'd been watching the dynamic between mother and daughter carefully. Victoria would ask Chloe's opinion on technical decisions that she should have been discussing with the engineering leads. Chloe would nod thoughtfully and offer consulting-speak responses about efficiency and agile methodologies. Neither of them ever asked me about the technical feasibility of their ideas. The warning signs had been there for weeks. External consultants had been auditing our technical assets and IP portfolio. HR had been having conversations about team restructuring for efficiency. My name had been removed from internal technical documentation without explanation. Meeting invites that used to include me automatically were now going to senior staff only. When I asked about it, Victoria's assistant told me it was just a scheduling oversight. Yesterday, I'd overheard a conversation between Victoria and the head of human resources about securing key intellectual property before finalizing organizational changes. They hadn't noticed me in the break room, and I hadn't made my presence known. Now, after Chloe's comment about fantasy football, the picture was becoming clear. They were planning to formalize the patent transfer, then restructure me into a junior role where I couldn't challenge their technical decisions. I pulled into my apartment parking garage and sat in my car for a few minutes, listening to the rain on the roof. The next morning, I arrived at the office early and found an email waiting for me. The subject line read, IP licensing agreement. Please review and sign. It was from Victoria, sent at 11:47 p.m. the night before. The agreement outlined the transfer of my 4 patents to TechFlow Systems in exchange for a one-time payment of $15,000 and a promotion to Senior Technical Specialist. The promotion was meaningless, the payment was insulting, but the timing told me everything I needed to know. They wanted my patents secured before they announced whatever organizational changes they had planned. I sat back in my chair and thought about what this meant. They were keeping me around long enough to finalize the IP transfer, then probably sidelining me before I could become a threat to their new management structure. My patents would become company property, giving them permanent control over the technology I'd created. After that, I'd be expendable. The office started filling up around 9 a.m. I watched people settle into their routines, checking emails and grabbing coffee. None of them knew what was coming. At 10:30 a.m., Chloe walked past my desk carrying her iPad and looking important. She was wearing a different designer outfit and had her hair pulled back in a way that made her look older than her 25 years. She glanced at my screen where I had the licensing agreement open and smiled. "Morning, Alex. Ready for another exciting day of development work?" I looked at her for a moment, then at the agreement, then back at her. Something clicked into place in my mind. This wasn't just about management restructuring or efficiency improvements. This was about securing my technology before pushing me aside. I closed the email and opened my personal cloud storage. My patent documentation was stored in encrypted folders, not on company servers. The source code was integrated into their platform, but the underlying frameworks were still documented in my private repositories. I started making a list of everything that belonged to me versus everything that belonged to the company. The list was longer than I'd expected. At noon, I packed up my personal laptop and walked out to my car. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just needed to think clearly about what came next. I drove to a coffee shop near the waterfront and spent the afternoon making phone calls to my lawyer. I returned to the office the next day with a plan. I'd spoken with my lawyer, Marcus Williams, for 2 hours the previous evening. He'd reviewed my employment contract and confirmed what I already suspected. My patents were still my property until the licensing agreement was signed. More importantly, any systems built using those patented processes were operating under an informal licensing arrangement that I could legally terminate. I decided to confront Victoria directly, professional, straightforward, no accusations. I wanted to give her a chance to explain the licensing terms and see if there was room for negotiation. I knocked on her office door at 2 p.m. She was on a conference call, but she motioned for me to sit down. Through the glass wall, I could see Chloe in the adjacent conference room presenting something to a group of people I didn't recognize. Probably more consultants brought in to evaluate our operations. Victoria finished her call and turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Alex, Thanks for coming by. I assume you've had a chance to review the licensing proposal? I have. I wanted to discuss the terms and make sure we're aligned on the value of the intellectual property. She leaned back in her chair. Of course, I know IP discussions can be complex, but I think you'll find our offer is quite competitive for this type of technology transfer. I kept my voice level. Victoria, these patents cover the core security framework that makes TechFlow competitive. The authentication system, the encryption protocols, the threat detection algorithms, they're all based on my innovations. Her expression shifted slightly. Well, yes, you've certainly made important contributions, but as you know, all work done during your employment creates intellectual property that should belong to the company. That's standard in our industry. The patents were filed before you joined TechFlow. I developed them using my own equipment, on my own time, with my own legal representation. She picked up a folder from her desk and flipped through it. Actually, I've been meaning to discuss that with you. Our legal team has identified some concerns about the patent filings. There are questions about whether any company resources were used during development. I felt my stomach drop. I have documentation proving everything was developed independently. I'm sure you do, but perception can be tricky in these situations. The board is concerned about potential liability issues if we move forward with an unconventional licensing arrangement. This was a trap. They were going to claim ownership regardless of the legal documentation, then tie me up in litigation I couldn't afford to fight. What are you proposing? We'd like you to accept the standard licensing terms, transfer the patents in exchange for the compensation we've outlined, then continue in your current role while we implement the organizational improvements. I stood up. I need some time to think about this. Of course, but Alex, I hope you understand that this is really the best outcome for everyone involved. Fighting this would be expensive and disruptive, and ultimately the company's position is very strong. I walked back to my desk and sat down, my hands shaking slightly. They had me cornered. If I tried to fight for fair compensation, they'd claim I was being unreasonable. If I agreed to their terms, I'd lose control of technology worth millions. Through the glass conference room wall, I could see Chloe finishing her presentation. The people she was talking to were nodding and taking notes. One of them was pointing at a chart that looked like an organizational diagram. My computer pinged with a new email notification. The sender was Human Resources. The subject line read, Team Restructuring Announcement, Confidential Preview. I didn't open it. Instead, I started thinking about what Marcus had told me during our phone call. The patents were mine until they weren't. The licensing arrangement was informal until it wasn't. But what if I simply declined to continue the licensing arrangement? That would mean TechFlow could no longer legally use my patented technology. Their platform would need to be rebuilt using alternative solutions. I opened my personal cloud storage and began reviewing the documentation for my patents. That evening I stayed late again, but this time I wasn't debugging code. I was conducting an audit of everything I'd contributed to TechFlow's platform over the past 3 years. The results were more extensive than I'd realized. My authentication framework was integrated into every user login, every API call, and every data transfer. Without it, their system would revert to basic security that any competent hacker could bypass. The encryption algorithms I'd developed reduced their data storage costs by approximately 40% and made their platform fast enough to compete with larger companies. The threat detection protocols enabled real-time monitoring features that were central to their marketing message. I'd essentially built the technological foundation that made TechFlow competitive in the cloud security market. Everything else was just user interface and business logic built on top of my work. But I found something more troubling as I reviewed old emails and meeting notes. Victoria and Chloe had been planning this acquisition for weeks before the licensing proposal. 3 weeks ago, Victoria had asked the engineering team to create detailed documentation of all technical processes and system architectures. She'd framed it as a routine knowledge management initiative. 2 weeks ago, Chloe had requested access to our code repositories for a strategic analysis of development efficiency. I'd granted the access because she was the CTO's daughter, and I'd assumed it was legitimate. Last week, I discovered that someone had been copying files from our shared drives to external storage. When I'd reported it to IT security, they told me it was authorized by senior management for backup purposes. Now I understood what had been happening. They'd been systematically documenting and copying everything I'd created so they could continue using it after securing the patent rights. I spent the next hour researching Victoria's background more carefully. Her previous job had been at a consulting firm that specialized in technology acquisition and integration. Before that, she'd worked for a private equity company that focused on buying distressed startups and extracting value from their intellectual property. She wasn't brought in to grow TechFlow. She was brought in to secure its most valuable assets. I called Marcus and explained what I'd discovered. He listened carefully, asked several questions about the timeline, and then delivered news that changed everything. Alex, based on what you're telling me, you have grounds for a formal withdrawal of licensing privileges. Your patents are still your property, and if they're using your technology without a signed agreement, you can legally require them to stop. But I'm employed by them. Doesn't that create an implied license? Not necessarily. Employment contracts typically cover future inventions, but your patents predate Victoria's arrival and the current organizational structure. There's ambiguity in their legal position. I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger this time, but clarity mixed with cold determination. What would happen if I withdrew the licensing privileges? Legally, you have that right. Practically, it would require them to remove your patented technology from their platform until they could develop alternative solutions. I looked around the empty office, thinking about Chloe's dismissive comment about fantasy football and Victoria's patronizing smile during our meeting. How quickly could you draft the withdrawal notice? I can have it ready by tomorrow morning, but Alex, this is a significant step. Once you do this, there's no going back. I made my decision. Do it. The next morning, I arrived at the office early and began implementing what Marcus and I had discussed. The withdrawal notice would be delivered to Victoria at 10 a.m., giving me a narrow window to prepare for the consequences. My first step was to change all the passwords and access credentials for my personal development systems. TechFlow's platform was designed to authenticate against my proprietary security framework, but the framework itself was hosted on servers I controlled, not on company infrastructure. I'd built it that way initially as a security measure, but now it gave me leverage I hadn't fully appreciated. At 9:45 a.m., I sent an email to the entire engineering team, explaining that I would be conducting routine maintenance on the authentication system starting at 11 a.m. These kinds of notifications were common, and nobody questioned them. At 10 a.m., I watched through the glass wall as a courier delivered an envelope to Victoria's office. She opened it, read the contents, and immediately picked up her phone. Within minutes, Chloe was in her office, and they were both staring at the legal document. At 10:30 a.m., Victoria's assistant called my extension and asked me to come to the conference room immediately. I declined, explaining that I was preparing for the scheduled maintenance window and couldn't be interrupted. At 11 a.m., I began the process of disconnecting TechFlow's platform from my patented security framework. The effect was immediate but controlled. Instead of a sudden crash, the system began degrading gracefully. User login attempts started failing intermittently. API calls returned authentication errors. Real-time features stopped updating. Within 30 minutes, the customer support phone lines were receiving complaints about system performance. The platform status page showed yellow warnings across multiple services. The engineering team was scrambling to understand what was happening, but they couldn't access the underlying authentication system because it was no longer available to them. My phone started ringing. I didn't answer it. At 11:30 a.m., Victoria stormed out of her office and walked directly to my desk. Her face was red and her hands were shaking. "Alex, what the hell is going on with the system?" I looked up from my laptop where I was calmly monitoring the disconnection process. "I'm exercising my legal rights as outlined in the withdrawal notice. My patented technology is no longer available for unauthorized use. This is sabotage. You're destroying the company." "I'm protecting my intellectual property. There's a difference." Chloe appeared next to her mother, looking panicked. "Can't you just turn it back on? We can work this out." I met her eyes directly. "You told me to go back to my fantasy football games. I'm taking your advice. I'm no longer participating in the technical operations of this company." Victoria was on her phone, probably talking to their lawyers. Other employees were gathering around my desk, trying to understand what was happening. The platform had been degrading for an hour, and their biggest clients were starting to make concerned phone calls. At noon, I packed up my personal laptop and headed for the elevator. The office was in controlled chaos. Developers were running between workstations trying to implement emergency fixes that wouldn't work because they didn't understand the underlying architecture. Victoria was in heated conversation with someone on speakerphone who was probably from the board of directors. As the elevator doors closed, I could hear Chloe shouting at one of the senior developers. "What do you mean you can't rebuild the authentication system? Just code around it." The developer's response was exactly what I had expected. "We can't code around it. The entire platform depends on Alex's framework. Without it, we need to rebuild everything from scratch." I drove home and spent the afternoon fielding phone calls from reporters who had somehow gotten word that TechFlow was experiencing major technical difficulties before their scheduled investor presentation. The investor presentation was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9 a.m. Pacific Time. Victoria had spent the previous 3 days assembling an emergency team of contractors and consultants to rebuild the authentication system without my patented technology. According to my contacts still inside the company, they'd been working around the clock, spending over $200,000 on emergency consulting fees. I woke up early on Thursday and made coffee while monitoring the technology news websites. Several industry publications had picked up the story of TechFlow's technical difficulties, but the full scope of the problem wasn't public yet. At 9 a.m., I watched the live stream of their investor presentation. Victoria was presenting to a room full of venture capitalists, potential clients, and technology journalists. She looked confident as she demonstrated the new features and talked about the company's growth trajectory. At 9:30 a.m., during the live demonstration portion of the presentation, she invited the audience to test the platform themselves using guest accounts that had been set up specifically for the presentation. The emergency authentication system they'd built couldn't handle the concurrent load of 75 users trying to log in simultaneously. Error messages cascaded across the screen. Database connections timed out. The entire platform became unresponsive. Victoria tried to keep presenting while her technical team scrambled to fix the problems in real time. But after 15 minutes of watching engineers frantically typing on laptops, while the audience whispered among themselves, she had to stop the demonstration. "We're experiencing some minor technical difficulties," she announced, her voice betraying her growing panic. "We'll resume the demonstration shortly." They never resumed it. After 45 minutes of failed attempts to restore functionality, Victoria ended the event early and asked everyone to leave. The technology blogs published their reviews within hours. The headlines were brutal. TechFlow presentation crashes spectacularly. Cloud security company can't secure its own demo. When technical debt meets investor reality. The board of directors called an emergency meeting for Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, Victoria Sterling was no longer the chief technology officer of TechFlow Systems. The press release cited strategic differences regarding technical leadership and product development. Chloe Sterling was quietly removed from the strategy analyst position without any public announcement. According to my former colleagues, she'd attempted to blame the platform failure on sabotage by a disgruntled employee, but the board's investigation revealed the timeline of events leading to my departure. Her accusations only highlighted the management failures that had caused the crisis. The company's valuation, which had been rising in anticipation of the investor presentation, dropped 45% over the following week. 2 major clients canceled their contracts. 3 board members resigned. The planned Series B funding round was postponed indefinitely. Meanwhile, I was fielding phone calls from venture capital firms and technology companies who wanted to license my patents. By the end of the month, I'd signed licensing agreements with 2 of TechFlow's competitors and founded my own startup with $15 million in Series A funding. The new company, which I named Secure Core Technologies, specialized in enterprise authentication solutions. Our first major client was a financial services firm that had been burned by unreliable security platforms in the past. Our second client was a healthcare company that needed compliance-grade authentication for patient data systems. 6 months later, TechFlow was acquired by a larger company for 30% of their previous valuation. The acquiring company's first move was to completely rebuild the platform, using industry-standard security frameworks, effectively discarding everything that Victoria and Chloe had tried to preserve. Victoria Sterling returned to consulting work, though her reputation in the technology sector had been significantly damaged. Chloe Sterling left the tech industry entirely and took a marketing job at a retail company in Portland. Neither of them ever acknowledged their role in the company's collapse, but the technology community has a long memory for failed leadership. When reporters asked me why I'd left TechFlow so abruptly, I kept my answers simple. Sometimes protecting what you've built requires walking away from people who don't understand its value. The real lesson was quieter, but more important. Technical expertise can't be faked or inherited, and dismissing someone because of their age or background is a mistake that compounds quickly in an industry built on knowledge and innovation. Respect and competence aren't negotiable. They're earned through results, not rhetoric. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe to check out more stories on my channel.